Please be seated. I open this academic ceremony in which Mr. Gupta defends his academic thesis, Inhomogeneities in Spontaneous Brain Fluctuations. Mr. Gupta, I invite you to give an overview of the research you have done.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here for my PhD defense. I really feel honored. In this presentation, I'm going to briefly present part of my thesis work, that is inhomogeneities in spontaneous brain fluctuations. Brain regions get activated based on performed task or activity. For instance, in this image, based on the visual stimuli, occipital cortex region of the brain shows activation, which is primarily responsible for visual processing. These activations can be visualized using MRI scanner, which uses functional MRI methodology. Functional MRI methodology uses bold oxidation level dependence contrast to measure brain activation, and bold contrast depends on the balance between oxygen supply and the consumption by the neural tissue. Now, looking at the bold signal in more detail, in case of functional MRI, a subject performs a task based on predefined paradigm, and based on the task performed, corresponding brain region shows activation. For instance, in this case, if the subject has performed finger tapping, that is motor task, motor region of the brain shows higher bold intensity. However, the task only increases small amount of overall energy consumption by the brain. That essentially means that most of the energy is consumed by the brain at rest. Looking at the bold signal during task, it's kind of structured and it's kind of periodic. However, signal at rest is highly unstructured. Hence, it would need more advanced techniques for analysis. In this thesis, our primary focus was on bold signal at rest. Coming to the overall objective of the work, that was to develop and evaluate the quantitative measures describing the temporal inhomogeneity of dynamic bold data. The word inhomogeneity here refers to irregularity or randomness in bold fluctuations, and the feasibility of finding functional abnormalities in patients with epilepsy. Overall, there were 5 studies presented in this thesis. In this talk, we are going to briefly cover 3 of them. The theme of all the thesis was around development and quantification of inhomogeneities in bold data. There are several methods that are proposed in literature to quantify the inhomogeneities in bold data. One of them that focuses on measurement of low frequency oscillations is fractional amplitude of low frequency fluctuations, or simply amplitude. The bold spectrum shown here is computed by taking Fourier transform of the bold signal, and the amplitude measure is computed using the bold spectrum. Amplitude measure is defined as the ratio of total power in predefined frequency range to that of total power in complete frequency range. The predefined frequency range is conventionally used as 10 to 80 millihertz. As you can observe here, the amplitude in this frequency range is higher compared to the amplitude in higher frequency range. We used the same concept for one of our studies. That was around single seizure patients. These patients are those who had just one seizure till the point they were followed up. Coming to the clinical problem related to the study, around 4% of the people will have one or more seizures in their lifetime. However, around only 1% of these will end up having diagnosis with epilepsy. Clinical assessment only seldom provides a definitive diagnosis. Therefore, we need diagnostic tools that can differentiate between patients with single seizure who would remain normal or who will end up in epilepsy. The objective of the study was to compare spontaneous fluctuations in bold signal in single seizure subjects, in new onset epilepsy patients, and healthy controls. And as I mentioned earlier, we used amplitude measure for our analysis. It was observed that in conventional frequency range, the new onset epilepsy had significantly lower amplitude compared to healthy controls. However, there were no significant differences between single seizure subjects and new onset epilepsy patients. However, in slow 3 subband, we found significant differences between new onset epilepsy patients and single seizure subjects. One of the reasons could be that in lower frequencies, single seizure subjects show some kind of abnormality which was not prominent enough to categorize them in as patients, hence there was no significant differences. However, in slow 3 subband, they did not show any abnormality, hence there was a significant differences. Clinically, this is an important result and a step forward to differentiation between single seizure subjects who would end up with epilepsy and the ones who would remain normal. As you can observe here, the amplitude measure in slow 3 subband increases from healthy controls to single seizure subjects to new onset epilepsy. The subject with single seizure did not show any abnormality on EEG, and very few of them showed white matter lesion, which are non-specific. However, they had elevated amplitude, which could be an indicator for repeat MRI. However, this needs a larger validation study. As you can observe, we use Fourier transform to compute amplitude measure for the bold signals, which are likely non-stationary. Stationary signals are those which where the frequency would repeat after a certain time period. However, that's not the case in case of bold signals. An alternative could be to use wavelet transforms, which does not make any assumption about stationarity of the signal and analyzes the signal at different frequency subbands with different time resolutions. It uses a shifted and scaled version of mother wavelet function, which is multiplied with the signal to get the wavelet subbands. Showing an example here. Here is the signal with 2 frequencies, and you can observe in the frequency plot below, the 2 peaks represent the 2 frequencies present in the signal, and the plot on the right shows wavelet subbands. As we introduce a non-stationary component to this signal, you can observe the small peak starts to appear in the Fourier spectrum. However, in case of wavelet subbands, there was a significant difference. I'll just go back to show you the differences. So you can observe here how the different subbands change as we introduce a small non-stationary component to the original signal. These changes motivate us to use a wavelet-based concept on bold data. For one of our study, where our objective was to characterize intrinsic non-stationary abnormalities in brain bold signal, we used a similar concept. We used a data set of children with rolandic epilepsy and age-matched healthy controls for this study. The primary clinical motivation to use this data set was that there were no structural lesions in this data set. And we used a wavelet analysis-based wavelet entropy measure for our analysis. Wavelet entropy is a measure of signal irregularity, or basically randomness in different wavelet energy subbands. You can observe here there is an oscillating signal, which is actually a sine curve. The complete wavelet energy is confined to just one wavelet subband. Hence, low surprise, hence lower wavelet entropy. For the signal, which is completely random, which is highly unstructured, the wavelet energy is sort of equally distributed across subbands, which means higher surprise and hence higher wavelet entropy. However, for a brain signal, wavelet energy reduces from lower subband to a higher subband in a structured fashion. And the wavelet entropy was, therefore the wavelet entropy was in between a random signal and a perfectly oscillating sine signal. For our data set of rolandic epilepsy, we found that wavelet entropy for rolandic patients was significantly higher than for controls. There were no effects seen using any conventional measure or amplitude measure. One of the reasons could be that using wavelet subbands, we could resolve the bold signal, in this case, with better time and frequency resolution. The significant differences were seen in rolandic strip that we would expect for these patients. And also the differences are also seen in various different regions, including default mode network regions. There has been published studies that show that for Rolandic patients showed abnormalities in default mode network regions in addition to Rolandic strip. We used inhomogeneity measures for one of other study, which was related to focal cortical dysplasia. As you can observe here, the focal cortical dysplasia lesion in T1 weighted images shows cortical thickening and white matter blur. And for FLAIR images, it shows a hyperintensity in white matter. Clinically, this study was of high significance because it is known that delineations using MR structural images do not necessarily reflect the functional borders of focal cortical dysplasia lesions. And that leads to unsuccessful surgical treatments. In this context, the objective of our study was to determine the abnormalities in spontaneous bold fluctuations that arise in FCD lesion and its proximal or the neighboring regions. We used wavelet entropy and amplitude measure for our analysis. You can observe in this image that is shown for the individual patient on the right, there is a lower amplitude that goes beyond the boundary that is shown in the FLAIR image. And for the wavelet entropy also, you can observe a higher wavelet entropy that goes beyond the lesion boundary compared to the FLAIR image. This is an individual case. At the group level, it was found that amplitude was significantly lower and wavelet entropy was significantly higher in FCD lesion and the regions up to 2 centimeters from the FCD lesion compared to contralateral homotopic region and the controls. This is an interesting result and could be a critical information for the surgery planning. To summarize, we found various quantification measures that were useful to quantify the inhomogeneities in bold data, which included an amplitude and wavelet entropy. Wavelet entropy measures could quantify the irregularities in bold, where amplitude measure could not in one of the data sets. And inhomogeneity measures that could capture inhomogeneity measures showed promise to capture abnormalities in patients with single-cell subjects, in epilepsy patients with and without visual lesions. And they were also found to be useful in brain tumors. The methods that are presented in this thesis were extended based on the existing method, which should be further evaluated in clinical setting before they could be applied to individual patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. We're now moving to the opposition, and the opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Ahrens, who is Professor of Ambulatory Monitoring of Epilepsy and Related Disorders at TU Eindhoven, Technical University Eindhoven, and at the Epilepsie Zentrum Kempen Hees. Professor Ahrens.
Thank you. I prefer to first to thank you for the work you have done. It's very nice to see that these fluctuations exist. Perhaps persons will doubt about it, but I don't know now. But suppose they exist, and I would like to look to the Rolandic epilepsy case you presented. From a scientific perspective, I would have liked that you have more paid attention to the background of these spontaneous brain fluctuations. For example, in Rolandic epilepsy, a very good characteristic is the EEG activity. It's very special in Rolandic epilepsy. You have a lot of intellectual activity, spike waves, and it's very variable, and almost no seizures. So it would be very simple to think that there will be a relation between the spontaneous brain fluctuation and the amount of interactivity in the EEG. But I have not seen any table about the clinical characteristics in chapter 3, and even not about the EEG, but I would like to ask you the question, what do you think about that kind of relation? Have you thought about that relation between epilepsy and those spontaneous fluctuations or not?
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the question. So I have gone through several studies that talk about relation between EEG and the Bold spectrum and the functional MRI Bold data. So for example, the alpha waves in EEG refer to slow 3 subband, the characteristics shown in slow 3 subband in functional MRI. We have not analyzed it particularly, but if the data set was available for simultaneous acquisition of EEG and functional MRI, it would be a very useful extension of this work.
Yes, but did you, two questions, did you think about doing that? And I know that the databases here, they have a historical EEG often as part of the database, so you could have done this on historical data.
So the primary objective of the study related to rhodantic epilepsy, we wanted to explore the wavelet entropy effects or the effects that we could capture for using wavelet entropy on these patients.
Yes.
So therefore, our primary focus was to compare the results that we achieve using wavelet entropy and to compare what has been already published on the resting state data.
Yes, but I would like that my question is about extension to some scientific background.
Yes. So it would be really useful. Now we know that wavelet entropy is useful, and they could and it could be useful to characterize these patients. The logical extension of this work is actually to compare the effects that we see using wavelet entropy with the EEG dataset.
But you never thought about doing it yourself?
In the context of my thesis work, the focus was mainly on the resting state functional MRI.
Yes. And did you discuss with other people this kind of, how likely do you think these correlations will be?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the alpha waves correspond to the slow 3 subband, and similarly, beta waves they mainly correspond to the conventional frequency subband.
And spike waves. Spike waves, how do they correlate?
I really cannot comment on how they would correlate with the Bold data, but that would be really, really interesting and
because there must be data about this, and you could have told that. So I like the work you did, but I think that from the perspective of scientific broadening, I would have expected some more sharpness. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. De Witt, Hochlehrer Signalwerking, especially video coding and architectures from the Technical University of Eindhoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Dear candidates, first I want to congratulate you with doing this work and presented that in a nice thesis, as you did over here. And I also enjoyed your summary, so it clarifies some aspects already very clearly. Now, I have a background in imaging, as the chairman just indicated, and I also did some work in information theory. Actually, I graduated in that as a master. So you can imagine that I will focus on some of your definitions and the work that you did in that, right? Especially in chapters 2 and 3. Now let's start with chapter 2. On page 20, you introduce the entropy as a measure of randomness, as you call it,
Yes.
based on the elements of the co-occurrence matrix.
Yes.
Now, the co-occurrence matrix is invented actually to show the variations in the signal in all various aspects, right? In the time domain, mainly, to a large extent. So, let's say the background of entropy is coming from statistical physics. Maybe you have studied that. And also, Shannon defined in 1948 his beautiful paper on information theory and mathematical theory, which is based on probabilities. Actually, both entropy definitions are based on probabilities. Now, in your definitions, you use elements of that co-occurrence matrix, Cij, right? Is that a real probabilistic nature, or are you construing actually the definition of entropy for your own purpose? I can even go along with that, but I would like to hear your motivation on that.
Yes, Dr. Dev, thanks for the question. So co-occurrence matrices has been widely used in texture analysis.
Yes.
I think the first paper was published in 1975 around.
Yes, correct.
And the entropy measure of the co-occurrence matrix has also been widely used in textual analysis in various image processing literature. So this measure is actually a well-defined measure for feature extraction measure for textual analysis. And now coming to the your question about the probability. Co-occurrence matrices actually, it actually talks about the probability. It actually talks about the frequency of co-occurrence of two elements, the changes in element from location I to location J, for instance. Now when we, so this is the matrix itself talks about the frequency. And then if you just take all the elements into account, so it actually talks about the probability of seeing this particular transition from element I to element J.
Yeah, but the question is there a real probability? Because you have a local area that you investigate, right? Which has nothing to, that's, let's say, you can hardly call it, it's a sequence that you measure, right? In terms of counting, as you indicate. So the definition of probability over here can be hardly defended because it's a very local area that you analyze. And let's say to sharpen up the debate a little bit, I think I have some scientific evidence from your own thesis actually, because if I look to chapter 2 on page 27 and 28, you present figures 2.2 and 2.3, right? And you can see the subfigures D, you see the differences between patient and controls for the entropy, right?
Yes.
Now, maybe you are an expert in seeing differences, but I see that they are very small. I would call them negligible, actually.
Yeah, so there were no significant differences
Exactly.
in entropy.
And I can explain, I have an idea why there are no differences, actually, because the entropy is the average of the source information. So you average the occurrences over here. Okay, so, and that means that you, with this choice, you might not choose the correct metric, actually, to show those differences. Now, this is my explanation, but maybe you have more background on these figures, so maybe you have something that
Yes.
I've overlooked,
I
maybe,
just-
or another argument.
Yeah, I just want to, I mean, my argument would be that, so co-occurrence matrices, as it is used in normal texture
Yes.
analysis literature,
Yes.
there are various features of co-occurrence matrices that are used, which includes entropy, homogeneity, or maybe the contrast
Yes.
kind of measures.
Yeah.
And in true sense, if you look at so co-occurrence matrices, first of all, the matrix actually talks about it's computed for the whole image. The one matrix for the whole image or the whole volume. And there it talks about different frequency of co-occurrence of two elements. To me, it sounds very similar to what you spoke about the Shannon entropy. When you talk about the frequency, you actually measure the frequency of occurrence of particular element, similarly in Shannon entropy. And then when you divide it by the total number of elements, you actually get the probability of different probabilities.
Yes, but Shannon is very exact in his definition. I don't know whether you have read that paper, but I did that. And it says he defines a source as a discrete source where the probabilities are stationary. So you must have done so many experiments so that the probability estimate is valid as a definition, and then you can compute that entropy. If you're not in that status yet, then the definition of entropy is only an estimate, and the shorter the time series that you have, the less reliable the definition is.
So these co-occurrence matrices in chapter 2, they are not computed from the time series.
Mm-hmm.
They are actually computed from the whole volume, the brain volume images.
Good, now you're talking, so that's a good argument, I think. The question is, how many images are then involved in that?
So for each image separately, so for each volume separately, we find one matrix.
Yes.
And then based on that matrix, we compute these parameters, which include entropy, homogeneity.
So, for each
For,
image, you mean?
for one image, we find the co-occurrence of two elements.
Yes, of course. So you do that within an image, right? Which is then a local statistics, I think. Now let's broaden up this discussion a little bit. In chapter 3, you come with the concept of wavelet entropy, right? Which is interesting. So to that end, you define a wavelet transform. We all know that. That's all in literature. That's good stuff. And you come up with an 8-band system, finally. You do that on page, let me see, 49, you give the introduction already, but section 3.2, page 47, for example, right? Now, now, if we look what you're actually doing is you take the wavelength coefficients and you square them to call them energy in a band,
Yes,
right?
energy.
Which is decent, that can be chosen. Now, now you're again you're going to compute again that entropy over 8 bands, right? But is that really what you want? I understand that you want to measure the distribution of the wavelength energy, because that gives an indication about the randomness you indicate. But you can take entropy for that, but you could also take another metric, which could even be more pronounced than what you have found now, so that the discerning between spectral energy and wavelength energy is much more visible than you have now. For example, you could impose the model that you want to have for a set of patients, and every deviation would be directed going to the controls, for example. Then the discrimination between the two would be much larger than what you have now, because again, entropy is averaging the information.
So here our objective in this work was to first of all to show how we can use wavelet analysis over Fourier analysis on the board data.
Yes.
That was where we actually started.
Yes.
Now coming to the measure, we actually had one of the measure that we also discussed is actually to define the model of the change of different wavelet energy in different subbands.
Yes.
That is actually where we started.
Yes.
But wavelet energy, wavelet entropy, it has been published in the context of EEG.
Yes.
Which also could find the differences between in the board data, which would be more acceptable since this has already been published. And we actually had what exactly you said about the slope and getting the line and getting the energy. That was actually is the the extension of this work that we
I
already
understand.
worked on it.
I understand. Okay. Thanks for your
Thank you.
notation.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Allenkamp, Professor in Imaging and Cognition and Epilepsy, Maastricht University.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. At the end you will be tired from all the congratulations, but I add one to the already given congratulations and similar congratulations to your supervising team. Remote supervision is not easy for both parties. Beautiful book. I was a little bit surprised that this is the book that I received by mail, and this is the book that's here now. It seems to have lain in the sun in India for quite some time. It seemed to be different, but I paged through it and the content was similar. Okay. I want to challenge you to discuss with me about some of the clinical implications. You promise on page 156 that you use these methods to understand and characterize certain illnesses or conditions. I would have loved if you would have included patients actually in which we do not yet understand the brain characteristics such as neuropsychiatric disorder or dementia. But okay, you took, among others, epilepsy, Rolandic epilepsy, and that's fair because in a way Rolandic epilepsy is still a puzzle. Why seizures that originate from the motor strip with such many connections with the rest of the brain result in partial elementary seizures. So apparently the seizure activity remains focal and does not generalize easily. Why does this type of epileptiform activity generate nocturnal seizures? Why do siblings often have Rolandic discharges without the Rolandic epilepsy? There are many puzzles here, and it's fair to say that you delivered, you looked at it from a new perspective. We coined this perspective neurodynamics, looking at the time series, and then you end up with a stronger non-stationary temporal signal fluctuation. And as a clinician, I'm lost. So could you try, I know you have a technical background, but could you try and explain this for a poor clinician in what does it mean in terms of brain activity? What happens in these brains? Are these overexcited, or are these noisy brains or something like that? Some of the audience are used to these kind of questions from me, but could you try?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll try to explain. What we observed here is there is a characteristic, there is a frequency spectrum, a frequency characteristic of the bold signal. If that is altered, that means there could be some kind of abnormality. Now different features or different measures describe this abnormality in different way. For example, if we talk about amplitude measure, if amplitude measure is lower than controls, we say there is some kind of inhibition in the bold activity, or which could also be related to how actually the brain region behaves. If the amplitude is higher than the controls, we say there is some kind of excitation. Similarly, for wavelet entropy, what we could think is because the way wavelet entropies works is like we saw that significant differences in the lower subbands for these patients and increase in the higher subbands. That means there is some kind of more high frequency phenomena and some kind of lower, so low frequency oscillations or low frequency signal has dropped. That could mean that these brains have some kind of added noise and less neural activity. So I looking at the bold spectrum, the way I would, from somebody from the technical background who understands some part of clinical signal, would read is my brain signal should have this amount of power in the lower frequency subbands and this amount of power in the higher frequency subbands. If that shifts, that means that there is some kind of added noise. That means lower brain activity.
Could we have added that noise? Could it be the medication? I know this patient group, they all have medication.
Yeah,
Did you look at it?
We do discuss this, that it could be because of medication, it could be because of different reasons that we really cannot conclude on.
Did you control for this?
Yes.
Okay. So there was no effect of the medication, or you don't know?
We don't know that.
Other question, if I'm allowed. Normally we would ask one of the par names to read this, but could you read for us your proposition 5 aloud, please?
Yeah. So imaging companies should take responsibility for providing the most clinically effective MRI post-processing methods in commercial imaging platforms.
Here, never in the book, never in the content, but here you see that you're appointed by Philips, and I do not agree. I know in the beginning MRI was a challenging issue in terms of you needed a technical infrastructure, you needed technical expertise, and most of our research was done in that period in a twin approach, always coupling a clinician to a technician. So we really knew what we were doing. Well, these days, if you look at MRI centers, other persons appear behind the console, neuroscientists, doctors. That's possible because there are beautiful neuroscience and clinical tools provided by General Electric or Siemens or Philips, and they simply have to push buttons. So you scan a patient, you choose a sequence, you scan a patient, push a button, and you get a beautiful DTI result. How do we know that it's actually valid what we are doing? Can we recalculate what we are doing? No, because they're closed tools owned by commercial companies. I think this is a risk, and I wonder what your opinion about this is. I would alter this proposition in we need open platforms in which industry and the science and clinical community cooperate, like we do these days with publications. Your opinion from the Philips view.
With reference to the proposition, what I mean is that it's not the imaging companies should take the responsibility to provide the best available algorithms. They should not really compromise on some substandard algorithms because of the cost issues or any of the issues. That is what I wanted to point out here. Now, coming to the point that you made, that platform should be open, and I mean, as you asked me from the Phyllis point of view, what I would say is
No.
So these companies, what I feel is they should be an option for advanced users that should be provided, and I believe it is provided, where any sequence can be altered and used the way you like.
Well, I don't know whether we have this. We don't know, even know that you are making compromises in the software, for example. You have a clear political answer. Thank you for it. Hand over the word to the product.
Now, the opposition will be continued by Dr. Schreins, who is a neurosurgeon at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prof. Dear Mr. Gupta,
Thank you.
thank you for your nice presentation. Your scientific work, also your promotion team, very nice. As a clinician, I have some questions, clinical questions. And I would like to go with you to chapter 4, page 75, 78 and 84, figure 4.3. You have classified 3 groups of persons. A control group, of course, and then 2 groups of patients. First fit group and patients, the knowing group, I will call it for short. And you say on page 75, first paragraph, that special cases are those subjects presenting with the first unprovoked seizure after the age of 40, but with EEG and or MRI abnormalities. And then when I look some pages further, table 4.1, page 78, then I see in the first seizure group that you included a patient with a heterotopia. That's a typical epileptogenic lesion. And you have 3 patients with gliosis. And we know after surgery that sometimes a gliosis on MRI is diagnosed as a focal cortical dysplasia by the pathologist. That means that's also typical epileptogenic lesions. Aren't you afraid of inducing a selection bias by excluding all those patients above 40 with a positive 3 Tesla MRI signal and the first fit? Probably they belong in the no-way group, but you assess them, as you explain this, in the FF group. And when you do a follow-up study with, for example, more participants and a longer follow-up time, perhaps the statistical significance will disappear.
I understand your question, and I really appreciate your observation here. So these patients were followed up for around 2 years before we really had the final groups that were decided by the neuroradiologist mainly. So when we started this study, we had some particular patients in different groups, and over the course of time, there were 7 patients from the first seizure, group, single seizure group, that were moved to the new onset epilepsy group over the period of time, and this were as per recommendations from our co-author neuroradiologist. So I would I cannot really comment on the group selection here, but I would really say that during follow-up they must have remained normal. That is the reason that they were included into this group.
But would you stay to your standpoint when you do, for example, a follow-up study, that you exclude the patients with the MRI characteristic signal and the first fit above 40 years and put them in the FF? Would you stay to that standpoint?
Yes.
But perhaps you will lose statistical significance because it is logical that those patients will develop epilepsy.
So one more point that I want to bring in that would probably answer your question. So these patients, they had MRI scan, and at the point when they had only one single seizure. Over the period of time, it is quite possible they might develop abnormalities, and then I would say that they should go for a repeat MRI scan before we make any statistical significance at that point. Although I cannot say for sure, but it should be validated using a larger study or using the validation study. But I would say that at the point when they have developed some kind of abnormalities, we might see increase in the amplitude measure.
Okay, thank you. Second question, it deals about chapter 5, especially page 105, paragraph 553. And in that paragraph, you suggest that there is a discrepancy between the functional abnormality zone, as you describe it, and the anatomical zone. That means you are talking about focal cortical dysplasia type 2, which is visible in MRI. And you cautiously do a recommendation for the surgeon that the lesion, especially the functional abnormality zone, must be taken out completely in order to render the patient seizure-free. The term completely is a little bit controversial. As neurosurgeons, we made an evolution the last 10, 15 years to do more tailor-made resections. No standard resections, but more tailored resections. But we try to do it minimalistic in order to avoid injury. I would like to refer to a reference paper in this respect, Wagner et al. In Epilepsy 2011. I don't see it in your reference list, but they state that it's critical for seizure freedom, to reach seizure freedom, that it's necessary that you do a complete resection of the cortical abnormality, but not especially the subcortical abnormality, so-called transmental sign. It was a retrospective study, but they say they compare two groups, and in the group with a complete cortical resection, they had excellent seizure freedom. In the group where they left a signal in the subcortical area, they also had a very good seizure outcome. So they concluded you don't need to take out the subcortical lesion that needs, for example, the functional abnormality zone, and therewith avoiding neurological deficits by, for example, injuring the white matter tracts. So I cannot go with you to the standpoint you must take out, or we do a recommendation with this study to take out the functional abnormality zone, because I don't think there's evidence for that.
So in this study, we only analyzed the cortical cortex region of the brain. The white matter region was not analyzed, was not really taken into consideration. That was about the study, and I mean, I really appreciate your input here. But I just want to refer to, I mean, with related to the study in the, so what we have analyzed is only the cortex part. So when I say 2 centimeter, it's only in the cortex.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the position will be continued by Dr. Ruhl, who is a neurologist at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Well, Mr. Gupta, first of all, my congratulations to you and also your promotion team, who have done an excellent job in producing this scientific work, which may help us further in unraveling and helping us in earlier diagnosis in some diseases. I would like to take you to your sixth chapter, in which you describe glioma patients. And don't be afraid, glioma patients, I'm not a neuro-oncologist, so I won't go into detail about that. But when reading your subject composition, you describe 21 patients with a high-grade glioma and 30 patients with a low-grade glioma, and there is a subdivision, of course. Well, a little bit, I get the gut feeling that there might be some differences in those patients because they have not entirely the same tumors. And well, you state that you did not use the molecular profile in these patients. And well, when I'm now listening to my neuro-oncologists, my colleagues, they only talk molecular profiles in their patients, so and make all their decisions on that molecular profile. Well, could you comment on that, and what influence do you expect of the different histological subtypes and the different molecular profiles on your imaging characteristics?
So these patients were acquired before the new guidelines came in related to molecular profile, and therefore the molecular profiling was not done for these patients. So these patients were mainly characterized based on histopathology and also observation under the perfusion scans, MRI scans. So what I would really comment on is so what we observed in our analysis. So based on the perfusion analysis, what was observed that there was a very clear distinction between these high-grade gliomas and the low-grade gliomas, and therefore these patients were included in this study when there was confirmation about their their grades.
Well, I guess that's just a reflection of what we see in clinical MRI scans when using a gadolinium contrast. We see the enhancement. And then you see, well, so it's probably a high-grade glioma and a low-grade glioma. In this patient group, in this specific patient group, I cannot see this in this chapter, but did you also have a look at patients who were first on imaging classified as having a low-grade glioma, but later in histopathology having a high-grade glioma?
I really don't have that information with me.
Okay. So you didn't have the previous imaging data,
Yes.
so the clinical imaging data?
Yes, but all these patients had histopathology data.
Of course,
All
of course.
right.
You classify them like that. And another question also related to this patient group. You now classify them, or now you image them using imaging techniques well focused on perfusion or vascular parameters. These patients, I cannot imagine that none of these patients will have had epilepsy. Was it also measured or assessed in this population? Do you have that information?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't have that information.
Unfortunately. But do you see a possibility then just a hypothetical question, do you see a possibility then in these patients of, well, kind of predicting, using your knowledge from chapter 4, predicting in these patients too, which one of these patients will get epilepsy and which one will not be at risk for developing epilepsy?
Yeah, I believe that based on our results, there is a possibility, of course they should be further validated, to look at different measures and how the bold signal or bold spectrum is deviating from the controls group. So I do see a possibility there.
Yeah. And most epilepsy patients in brain tumors will be seen in the low-grade gliomas, because that's the most prevalent, also the most prevalent cause of presentation there. But given your results in the vascular profiles, you see most differences from controls in the high-grade group. That's not in contradiction to each other, you think? So more epilepsy in the low grade and more abnormalities, at least in the vascular
Okay.
profile, in
So-
the high grade.
Yeah, so so the analysis method that was used in this for glioma was actually the temperature. We did not analyze wavelet entropy or these kind of measures for these patients. In case of temperature, all we are trying to measure is how much is the hemodynamic shifts in these patients. For the high grade glioma, because of higher vascularity, what we would expect is that the hemodynamics might come a bit earlier compared to the contralateral region, and that was observed. So I would say it's a different metric. So maybe it would not be appropriate to compare the temperature shift measure with the some measures kind of a wavelet entropy. Hence, probably we see this kind of change in these.
So will not be any problem. Nice, a future project, thank you. Thank you, I give the words to the project.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Hommer, who's a medical physicist in clinical neurophysiology at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, it was with pleasure that I read your thesis, and I think it is well written, and it's good to see that already many chapters have been published. It's a very nice achievement, and I want to congratulate you already on this part of your work. I would like also to include your supervisor team. But since there is still time to discuss the content of your thesis, I'm happy to discuss with you on chapter 3, in which you looked at different entropy measures to quantify the irregular Bolt signals. You start in paragraph 332 by modeling different time series and evaluating the sensitivity of the different measures for the effect of adding non-stationary components to an initial harmonic signal. And you conclude that the wavelet entropy is very sensitive in detecting these changes. But this is based on single values, and it is without accounting for the spread you will find in real-life measurements. For these real-life measurements, we must look at table 3.2 on page 60. And here you summarize the results for all measures. And here I look at the standard deviation with respect to the mean of all these measures. For each measure and condition, you can calculate a so-called coefficient of variation as the standard deviation divided by the mean. And then I saw that the coefficient of variation is lower for the entropy of the time series than for the wavelet entropy when you look at the controls. This could mean that this Shannon entropy could be a useful measure to discriminate and more useful than the wavelet entropy. But when you then take a look at the standard deviation for the patients, this is much higher than for the controls. It's 0.187 versus 0.024 and 0.258 versus 0.031. Do you have a reason, do you know a possible reason for these higher standard deviations in patients in this time series entropy?
So when I was actually getting these results, I actually thought about it as well. And one of the reasons that I could think is, if you look at the spectrum of the patients, you see very high frequency components in patients compared to controls, especially at the end of like flow 3 or flow 2 subband. The very high frequency components in patients, and there are low.
And what do you call high frequency? Because for me it's all low frequency that you're doing here.
So when if you look at this, if you look at the figure 3.5, you can observe in bin 6 that patients have significantly higher frequency components compared to higher amplitude compared to controls in this in the high frequency.
Okay.
And this could be one of the reasons, because we see the larger variation in Shannon entropy. The way it is computed is you take this as single time points, or sorry, single values, and then you can bin them, and when you bin them, they would show the frequency in different bins, and based on that probability, this Shannon entropy is computed. So what could have happened in case of patients, because of the high frequency, these high frequencies may occur at any time point in the wider range, and that might have caused the variation in the Shannon entropy.
So you think actually that for the higher frequencies, contribution to the entropy measure is bigger than for lower frequencies?
It depends on where they occur. So if they all occur at a single time point, then we might not see it. But if there is a variation among patients, then we will see the variation.
Okay, that could be a question. That could be an explanation. I thought in a different direction actually, but maybe you can comment on that if that is logical to you or not. You describe on page 55 that you did some filtering on the original bold time series, so-called time spike filtering. And then, what is the cause of these artifacts that you want to eliminate?
So these artifacts can cause spikes in the frequency spectrum and also in the wavelength spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So by removing these artifacts, we remove any kind of noise that might be adding to these parameters.
But why do you call them artifacts? What is the origin of these spikes?
These spikes could be because of cerebrospinal fluid plus pulsation. That could be one of the reasons.
Okay, but that is a physiological phenomenon, isn't it?
So
it's not an artifact per se.
from the neural signal point of view, this could be seen as an artifact.
Okay.
From the physiology point of view.
But this filtering, this time spike filtering you apply, can that be a reason for this higher standard deviation in a time series way?
I don't think so. The reason is this filtering only removes certain spikes in the signal. It really does not change the shape of the signal.
Okay. No, I'm satisfied with your answers. And
So perhaps I might take the liberty of asking a question myself, Mr. Gupta, and I'd like you to read out your proposition 8, please.
It's health variables provide unreliable data and increase anxiety.
And my question is the problem with the health variables their unreliability, or generally that they increase anxiety even if they were to be reliable?
Actually, both, I would say. So the health variables, they are available from like $15 to maybe $500, and there are health variables which are used by the larger societies. Basically, they are not reliable. At times, when I wear my wearable, I find my heartbeat as 120, which is completely wrong. And I too get anxiety and would like to verify it. Another example that I want to give, even if the health variables are good, they don't really talk about. So just to give an example, there is these health variables. Let's say they count how many steps you walk, and based on the number of steps you walk, you might lose some kind of calories or you remain fit. But it also depends how you walk. So if you walk in an office setting, it won't help. You have to walk in a structured way. So they give some kind of a misinformation that increases anxiety.
However, if the community of biomedical engineers and signal processing experts, neurophysiologists, for example, were to develop an unobtrusive monitoring device for epilepsy, for example, that would allow people with frequent seizures to predict their seizures and then take relevant measures, wouldn't that be reducing health anxiety potentially?
So when I say health variables here, And what the health variables that you are talking about, I would say they are medical devices.
Okay.
They are not lifestyle devices. So the health variables that are currently thought of in the market, they are more of lifestyle devices, and they should not be used as a medical device.
So you're saying it's about the clinical,
Yes.
for some areas that could be clinically valid
Yes.
wearables, but then they would be in the classified as medical devices.
As medical devices.
Yes. I don't know whether anyone else in the opposition.
Yes, we have developed a medical device for seizure detection, and at first we thought we would lose from the normal medical device health wearables from Apple and so on, because they also were suited for some seizure detection. But we had a congress in Copenhagen where everybody gathered last year, and then we saw that those people are going to lose the battle, because they have no single software in it that can be controlled. It's like the thing you have to, and the software can be changed any moment. As soon as Apple, for example, changes the software, it is not more a medical device that can be used for seizure detection, and you don't know what happens. So the interesting thing was that all the people there that were from the health wearables companies, they were convinced that we would win with our medical device. Well, we thought those wearables are so cheap, they will win the market. It's a complex issue. It's nice that you have this. I had put the sign here. It was a very good proposition.
Yes. Are there more questions? We have a couple of minutes left. Yes.
You helped my thinking process a lot, speculating about the, let's say, physiological background of the mathematical biomarkers that you found for Atlantic epilepsy. That's now you're still here. Use you to do the same with the first seizure project. So if one needs to distinguish those patients that have only one seizure and one seizure only from those in whom this first seizure is the onset of true epilepsy. Well, we can use the EEG, but you do the MRI, and you look at the valves, fractional amplitudes of low frequency fluctuations. Now, could you speculate on, very shortly I think, on what kind of brain mechanism are we tapping here? What is the brain state of those patients if you translate it? I mean, we know when we have a first seizure and we see a lot of epileptiform discharges in the EEG, that the seizure threshold is probably lowered. So there's a highly excited brain, and there's a risk, and some of us will start treating already after first seizure. But what about your valves?
So what we are looking at is basically the brain excitation or brain inhibition. Brain excitation or brain inhibition. Basically.
We continue the discussion.
Mr. Gupta, the time for defending your thesis is over. The committee will take your defense into consideration, and therefore we ask you and your guests to leave this room.
Okay. Yeah.
U kunt wel plaatsnemen.
Mr. Gupta, the committee has reviewed your thesis and discussed the adequacy of its defense. Because of its positive judgment, it has decided to award the doctorate to you. Professor Bakkes is now authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction according to the Dutch university habits. I will give the floor to your supervisor.
Wil u gaan staan?
Thank you, Professor London. By authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Lalit Gupta, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present with you the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Congratulations, Lalit. Well done. Here you go.
U kunt wel plaatsnemen.
You can lay it down here. Well, dear Dr. Gupta, dear Lalit, the time is there. It's time to congratulate you with your PhD degree. These congratulations are not just for you, but also for your family and your loved ones, which I hope in some way will get a piece of this, of what happened here today. It's been quite a number of years ago. The facts say it was 2011 since we had first contact, by mail of course. Maastricht was looking for collaborations with institutions in India, including the Philips company in Bangalore. When I was correctly informed, you had a research job at this Philips company and you were working on the IntelliSpace product. To some employees, it was offered to start a PhD program in collaboration with professors from the Maastricht University. Many engineers explored these possibilities. However, from that list, it was you as one of the few that devotedly kept working on the science topic of this thesis. Well, and today is the day you succeeded. Well done, lad. On behalf of me and my colleagues, Professor Hoffman and Dr. Janssen, our biggest compliments for achieving this milestone for you. Well, collaborating in science with somebody on the other end of the globe is surely possible. Many people do it, but it's not as easy, I guess, as many think about this. It's not only the thousands of mails over and over that hamper a collaboration, but there is quite a huge cultural difference between our country and yours. Science is a discipline where people think, talk, discuss, quarrel, reconsider, and reformulate things. Your world is a world with unequivocal respect for older and senior people, how they think and how they speak. That's quite different here. Also, science profits from questioning everything and what is the current opinion and tries to turn each stone upside down. That's not trivial and must be different in a collaboration when someone wants to say no and thus disagrees with someone. That's not that trivial for you. Lalit, you were recommended highly for a PhD program, especially for your understanding of the mathematical and computational skills, and that was discussed a few minutes ago. And it's true, your skills are extraordinary. Very remarkable is the speed and accuracy at which you could do very complex mathematical analysis. Within a night, all corrections were understood and carefully and well thought out and finished. And exactly 8 a.m., a novel mail with attachment was already every day blinking in my mailbox. Afterwards, I have to emphasize that it was thanks to you that we could implement these novel analysis methods, like wavelet entropy and more, to analyze a complex signal as the ball time series. Now, well, usually the situation should be that the student should learn from the professor, but I have to admit my knowledge on waves and signals increased a lot thanks to you. And most of the time I only had the feeling that my job was to level you down so that the concepts and developments you made to make these accessible to preclinical and the clinical MR community I'm working in. Through the years, you changed your position a number of times. When the research job at Philips became too boring, you decided to switch to Norway and started to work for the Nordic Neurolab company. You wanted to gain experience, as your primary wish was to start your own company in time. Currently, you're back in Bangalore, at work on a contract basis for General Electric, while in parallel, you're working on your own company. Lalit, it remains me to thank you for a very learning period, to wish you very good luck with your dreams that hopefully will come out. But don't forget to make sufficient time for your wife and your daughter. And I hope we can also stay in touch. I said. Okay. to the reception. Don't forget this.
My congratulations again as well. That's great achievement. And yes, I think I'm entitled to announce a reception now at the Refter, which is will follow
Yeah.
here and
Coma. Hi. Hi. Dank je. Ga je ook in door. Sorry.